When we imagine ancient cities, we often picture places designed for life. Homes clustered together, markets buzzing with activity, streets built for people to move, rest, and belong. Comfort feels natural to us, almost expected. But what if that assumption is completely wrong? What if many of the most famous ancient cities were never meant to be comfortable at all? This video explores a truth that feels unsettling once you notice it. Discomfort was not a flaw in many ancient cities. It was a feature. Streets were narrow and dark. Living spaces were crowded. Heat, cold, noise, and exhaustion were part of daily existence. And this was not always due to poor planning or lack of knowledge. In many cases, cities were designed this way on purpose. Ancient urban centers were not built to make life easy. They were built to control movement, concentrate labor, enforce hierarchy, and keep people dependent on systems larger than themselves. Comfort slows obedience. Discomfort shapes behavior. And ancient city builders understood this far earlier than we like to admit. As we move through this story, we'll look beyond romantic ruins and examine how space itself was used as a tool, how density limited privacy, how layout restricted choice, how daily inconvenience trained populations to endure, adapt, and comply. These cities worked not because people enjoyed living in them, but because people learned how to survive within them. By the end of this video, you may never look at ancient streets, walls, or housing the same way again. What once seemed like accidental hardship may reveal itself as deliberate design. If you enjoy deep, unsettling history that challenges comfortable assumptions, stay with us until the end. And if you want more long-form explorations like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the city you think was the harshest to live in. Your support helps these stories continue. Now, let's step inside cities that were never meant to feel welcoming, only functional. Ancient cities were not designed with the idea that daily life should feel pleasant. This may sound strange to a modern audience, but comfort was not a goal shared by most early urban planners. What mattered far more was survival, control, durability, and concentration. Cities were tools, not homes in the emotional sense. They existed to organize labor, store resources, project authority, and protect what mattered most to those in power. Human convenience was secondary, and in many cases intentionally ignored. The modern idea of a city as a place that should improve quality of life simply did not exist. Instead, ancient cities were environments people had to adapt to, not environments that adapted to people. The burden of adjustment always fell on the population. Over time, this produced societies that were resilient, disciplined, and accustomed to hardship. From the perspective of ancient rulers, this was not cruelty. It was practicality. One of the most revealing examples is Rome, a city often romanticized as the pinnacle of ancient urban life. In reality, Rome was exhausting to live in for most of its population. Streets were narrow, dark, and constantly crowded. Buildings leaned over roadways, blocking light and airflow. Noise never truly stopped. This was not the result of poor planning or ignorance. It was the outcome of priorities that placed density and efficiency above comfort. Land inside city boundaries was precious. Walls were expensive to build and maintain, so cities grew inward rather than outward. Narrow streets allowed more buildings. More buildings meant more people. More people meant more labor and more control. Wide streets, open courtyards, and generous spacing would have wasted space that could otherwise be used productively. Comfort was a luxury that density could not afford. Housing reflected the same logic. Large numbers of people lived in tightly packed, multi-story structures with minimal ventilation and limited access to light. Privacy was almost non-existent. Rooms were small, ceilings low, and shared walls thin. Fire risk was constant. Noise traveled freely. Yet these buildings persisted because they served their function. They kept people close to work, markets, and administration. Proximity mattered more than peace. Living conditions trained behavior. When rest was scarce and space limited, people structured their lives around routine. There was little room for unpredictability. Daily schedules hardened into habits. Habits stabilized the city. A population accustomed to discomfort is less likely to resist it. Endurance became normal. This pattern was not unique to Rome. Cities such as Uruk demonstrate that early urban centers prioritized visibility and control over livability. Concentrated populations were easier to count, supply, and supervise. Administrative buildings were placed near dense residential zones not for convenience, but for oversight. Distance created independence. Proximity created dependence. Movement through these cities was rarely smooth. Streets twisted, narrowed, and intersected unpredictably. From a modern perspective, this seems inefficient. In reality, it limited speed and controlled flow. People moved slowly, deliberately, and visibly. Rapid movement attracts attention. Slow movement blends into routine. Cities were designed to encourage the latter. Open space was limited and rarely intended for leisure. Public areas existed for transaction, ceremony, or administration. Rest was a private problem, not a civic concern. A city that encouraged rest would have reduced productivity. Ancient cities demanded participation, not relaxation. Climate was endured rather than mitigated. Buildings offered minimal protection from heat or cold. Seasonal extremes affected everyone simultaneously. This shared exposure reinforced social rhythm. When everyone struggles together, expectations align. Alignment reduces friction. Water access further illustrates this logic. Systems existed to supply water reliably, not comfortably. Carrying water remained labor-intensive for many residents. This constant effort tied people physically to the city's infrastructure. Dependency on centralized supply reinforced obedience without the need for force. Markets were intentionally congested. Tight spaces ensured visibility of trade and standardization of exchange. Congestion slowed transactions, but it also prevented dispersion. A comfortable market would have allowed activity to spread beyond oversight. Discomfort concentrated activity where it could be monitored. Noise was not treated as a problem to be solved. It was an accepted consequence of density. In fact, constant noise discouraged secrecy. Privacy enables planning. Planning enables resistance. Noise dissolves both. When everyone hears everything, discretion becomes difficult. Even sanitation followed this logic. Waste management aimed to prevent collapse, not inconvenience. Removing waste completely would have required resources better used elsewhere. As long as the city functioned, discomfort was tolerated. Tolerance, not satisfaction, was the measure of success. Ancient cities also reinforced hierarchy through discomfort. While elites had better housing and location, they did not escape the city's fundamental harshness. This preserved visible hierarchy without creating emotional separation. Excessive comfort isolates elites psychologically. Limited comfort kept everyone within the same environmental reality. Durability was another priority that worked against comfort. Soft materials, decorative features, and spacious layouts degrade quickly. Harsh materials endure neglect. Stone, brick, packed earth, and tight construction survive generations of use. Maintenance was minimized. Longevity was maximized. Children born into these environments learned endurance early. Discomfort was not shocking, it was familiar. Familiarity shapes expectation. When expectations are low, systems feel stable. Stability was the true objective of ancient urban life. From a modern perspective, these cities seem inefficient, unhealthy, and harsh. But judged by ancient priorities, they were remarkably successful. They endured. They concentrated power. They organized labor. They survived centuries of continuous use. Ancient cities were not failures of compassion. They were successes of control. They were never meant to feel good. They were meant to work. And they did. To fully understand why ancient cities felt so harsh, we must look beyond physical structures and examine how discomfort shaped human psychology over time. Ancient urban life was not simply inconvenient. It was conditioning. Cities trained their inhabitants, slowly and relentlessly, to accept constraint as normal. Over generations, this conditioning produced populations that adapted their expectations downward, aligning their desires with what the city could provide rather than demanding what it could not. This was not accidental. Cities that were easy to live and encouraged choice. Choice encouraged movement. Movement weakened control. Ancient cities, by contrast, limited choice at every level. Where you lived, where you worked, how you moved, when you rested, all were constrained by spatial design. When choices are narrow, people stop imagining alternatives. They focus instead on survival within the given structure. Urban density played a central role in this process. High density created constant sensory pressure. Noise, smell, heat, and human proximity overwhelmed individual perception. In such environments, People learned to tune out stimuli rather than react to them. This desensitization reduced emotional volatility. Calm resignation replaced frustration. A population that reacts less intensely is easier to manage over long periods. This sensory overload also shortened attention spans. Long-term reflection requires quiet and space. Ancient cities offered little of either. Without opportunities for solitude, inward focus diminished. People remained outward-facing, responding to immediate needs rather than abstract concerns. Political awareness requires distance from daily survival. Discomfort eliminated that distance. Work patterns reinforced this effect. Most urban labor was repetitive, physically demanding, and time-consuming. Long working hours left little energy for questioning the environment itself. Fatigue narrowed perspective. When people are tired, they conserve thought. They accept rather than analyze. Cities that exhausted their populations did not need constant oversight. Exhaustion did the work. Housing conditions intensified this cycle. Crowded living spaces reduced individuality. Personal identity blurred into household identity, which blurred into neighborhood identity. Collective existence overshadowed personal aspiration. In such environments, personal dissatisfaction felt insignificant compared to shared hardship. This diluted grievance. When everyone struggles, struggle loses political meaning. The absence of comfort also discouraged permanence at the individual level while preserving permanence at the systemic level. People expected their lives to be difficult and short. The city, by contrast, was expected to endure. This imbalance shifted emotional investment away from personal well-being and toward acceptance of the city as an unchanging fact. When individuals see themselves as temporary and the system as permanent, resistance feels pointless. Ancient cities also used discomfort to regulate population flow internally. Those who could not adapt left, often for rural areas. This self-selection ensured that urban populations consisted largely of individuals capable of enduring hardship. Over time, cities became environments optimized for resilience rather than satisfaction. Survivorship bias reinforced the system. Those who remained normalized the conditions because they had already proven capable of enduring them. Public infrastructure reflected this logic. Water systems, roads, and storage facilities were designed to meet minimum functional thresholds, not to provide ease. Carrying water remained physically demanding. Roads were uneven and crowded. Storage was centralized and controlled. These features ensured dependence. When basic needs require effort and coordination, individuals rely on collective systems. Collective reliance strengthens authority. Food distribution further illustrates this point. Access to food was reliable enough to prevent collapse, but rarely abundant enough to eliminate anxiety. Mild scarcity kept people attentive to routine. Routine anchored them to the city's rhythm. Excess abundance would have allowed leisure. Leisure creates space for reflection. Reflection creates dissatisfaction. Cities avoided that risk. Time itself was structured around discomfort. Days began early and ended late. Seasonal extremes affected everyone simultaneously. There was little attempt to buffer populations from environmental hardship. Shared exposure synchronized behavior. When everyone rises, works, rests, and endures together, individual deviation becomes difficult. This synchronization extended into social norms. Displays of comfort or indulgence were often viewed with suspicion. They disrupted perceived balance. Balance mattered more than pleasure. Cities cultivated cultures that valued endurance, restraint, and conformity. These values were not preached. They were learned through lived experience. Even urban aesthetics reinforced discomfort. Decoration existed, but it was often concentrated in specific areas rather than distributed evenly. This unevenness signaled hierarchy without granting widespread comfort. People saw beauty but did not live inside it. Desire was stimulated but rarely satisfied. Controlled desire maintains engagement without fulfillment. The psychological effect of this environment was profound. Over time, people stopped interpreting discomfort as something imposed. It became the baseline. Baselines define what feels fair. When hardship is baseline, absence of hardship feels excessive. This inversion of expectation protected systems from moral critique. Ancient cities also limited escape. Walls were not only defensive structures, they were psychological boundaries. Leaving the city was possible, but it meant abandoning access to markets, networks, and opportunity. The city was harsh, but it was also necessary. This tension kept people inside systems they did not enjoy but depended upon. Dependence is more reliable than loyalty. Importantly, ancient cities did not need to justify their harshness. Justification invites debate. Debate invites change. Cities simply existed as they were. People adapted because adaptation was required. Over time, adaptation hardened into tradition. Tradition legitimizes discomfort. This helps explain why urban reforms were rare and incremental. Improving comfort would have required rethinking priorities. It would have altered rhythms, expectations, and power relationships. Such changes risked instability. Stability was valued above all else. As long as cities endured, their internal conditions were acceptable. From a modern perspective, this seems inefficient and even cruel. But ancient cities were evaluated by different standards. They were successful if they survived, if they organized labor, if they projected authority, and if they minimized disruption. Comfort did not contribute meaningfully to these goals. In fact, comfort threatened them. A comfortable population expects comfort. Expectations grow. Growth leads to dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction leads to demand. Demand creates noise. Noise destabilizes systems. Ancient cities avoided this cascade by never allowing comfort to become normal. This strategy worked. Cities lasted centuries despite disease, fire, overcrowding, and exhaustion. People complained, but they stayed. They adapted. They endured. That endurance was the point. Ancient cities were not failures waiting to be improved. They were solutions to the problem of organizing large populations with limited resources and technology. Discomfort was part of that solution. It disciplined bodies, narrowed imagination, and stabilized behavior. By the time anyone thought to ask whether life could be better, the city had already shaped the answer. This is why ancient cities should not be judged by modern standards of livability. They were never meant to nurture individual happiness. They were meant to persist. Ancient cities did not merely contain people, they pressed on them. Stone, brick, earth, and human bodies were packed together so tightly that the city itself became a constant physical force. Living inside these environments meant existing under pressure every day. This pressure was not only physical, but psychological, shaping how people moved, thought, and understood their place in the world. One of the defining features of ancient urban life was vertical confinement. As cities grew denser, buildings rose upward rather than outward. In places like Rome, multi-story residential structures dominated entire districts. These buildings were not designed for comfort or safety. Upper levels swayed slightly, floors creaked, staircases were narrow, and light barely reached the lower rooms. Yet people accepted this as normal because alternatives were limited. Vertical living compressed life into layers. Sounds traveled easily. Smells lingered. Privacy dissolved. This constant exposure to others reduced personal boundaries. When personal boundaries weaken, individuality softens. People begin to see themselves as parts of a mass rather than as separate agents. From the perspective of urban control, this was highly effective. Crowding also altered perception of space. In open environments, people judge distance, possibility, and escape differently. In crowded cities, space feels finite and closed. Walls are always near. Paths are always occupied. This spatial compression limits imagination. When people cannot physically see far, they rarely think far. Their concerns shrink to the immediate. Immediate concerns keep populations grounded. Ancient city streets intensified this effect. Streets were rarely straight or wide. They twisted, narrowed, and darkened as buildings encroached over them. Sunlight reached the ground in fragments. This created a sense of enclosure even outdoors. Movement felt constrained. Walking required attention. Attention focused on navigation, not reflection. Reflection requires openness. The constant need to navigate congestion trained people to move efficiently but cautiously. Sudden stops, fast movement, or unpredictable behavior disrupted flow and drew attention. Over time, residents learned to blend in. Blending in reduced friction. Reduced friction meant survival. Stone surfaces amplified sound. Footsteps echoed. Voices carried. Carts rattled. Noise was constant, but it was also impersonal. Individual sounds merged into collective background. This collective noise drowned out individual expression. Speaking loudly did not guarantee being heard. Silence became more practical than speech. Silence in crowded environments is adaptive. Living under constant sensory stimulation also reshaped emotional response. When everything is loud, nothing feels urgent. People learn to ignore stimuli that would overwhelm them if taken seriously. This emotional filtering reduced reactivity. Reduced reactivity limited conflict. A population that reacts less intensely is easier to govern. Ancient cities inadvertently produced emotional resilience through discomfort. Housing density also affected family structure. Extended families often shared confined spaces. Generations lived together not by choice, but by necessity. This reinforced hierarchy within households. Authority flowed downward. Obedience was learned early. These domestic hierarchies mirrored urban hierarchies, reinforcing acceptance of order at every level. Order learned at home translates easily to public life. Water access further illustrates how pressure shaped behavior. In many cities, water sources were centralized. Carrying water was physically demanding and time-consuming. This daily labor tied people's schedules to infrastructure. Missing water collection disrupted everything else. Dependence on shared systems reinforced conformity. When basic needs depend on routine, routine becomes sacred. Ancient cities also managed pressure through scarcity of personal space. There were few places to withdraw completely. Even religious or civic spaces were crowded and functional rather than serene. Solitude was rare. Without solitude, dissent remains internal and unarticulated. Unarticulated dissent fades. This lack of retreat prevented emotional buildup. People released frustration through labor and fatigue rather than reflection. Reflection requires stillness. Stillness was scarce. The city never truly rested. Night offered little relief. Darkness reduced visibility, but did not reduce activity. People continued to move, work, and listen. The city breathed continuously. This constant motion created the sense that the city was alive, larger than any individual. Living inside something that feels alive discourages confrontation. One does not challenge an environment. One adapts to it. Adaptation replaced resistance. Urban pressure also regulated time perception. Days felt long, but years passed quickly. When every day demands effort, individual days blur. Blurred days compress memory. Compressed memory reduces awareness of change. When people cannot clearly remember how things were before, they cannot easily judge whether things are getting worse. This memory compression stabilized authority. Ancient city infrastructure reinforced this effect by emphasizing repetition. Streets led to the same places. Markets followed the same rhythms. Work repeated endlessly. Repetition dulled awareness. Awareness dulled urgency. Urgency is the seed of change. Another important aspect of urban pressure was heat. Dense construction trapped warmth. In warmer climates, cities became heat reservoirs. Cooling was minimal. People adjusted activity to survive. Midday slowed. Early mornings and evenings intensified. Shared adaptation synchronized behavior across the population. Synchronization reduces deviation. Food preparation added to this environment. Cooking smells mixed with waste, smoke, and human odor. Clean separation between functions did not exist. This sensory blending reduced distinction between private and public life. When everything blends, individuality dissolves further. Ancient cities were environments of enforced proximity. This proximity also affected conflict. Disputes occurred, but escalation was risky. Too many witnesses. Too little space. Conflict drew attention. Attention brought intervention. Over time, people learned restraint not through moral teaching, but through spatial reality. Space disciplines behavior. Even architectural aesthetics contributed to pressure. Massive walls, towering buildings, and heavy materials communicated permanence and weight. The city felt older and stronger than its inhabitants. This perception shaped humility. One does not expect comfort from stone that outlives generations. Stone teaches patience. The cumulative effect of these factors was profound. Ancient cities created populations skilled at endurance. Endurance became virtue. Comfort became unnecessary. Complaints existed, but they lacked momentum. Momentum requires space. Space was scarce. Scarcity preserved order. From the outside, these cities may appear inefficient and cruel. From within, they were simply reality. People did not compare their lives to alternatives because alternatives were invisible or inaccessible. The city defined what life was. Definition limits desire. By shaping bodies, senses, emotions, and memory, Ancient cities ensured their own survival. They did not need to persuade or threaten constantly. They pressed, slowly, continuously, until adaptation became automatic. This is why so many ancient cities lasted far longer than their populations might have preferred. They did not rely on happiness. They relied on endurance. And endurance was built into every stone. The pressure created by ancient cities did not end at the walls or the streets. It followed people inward, shaping how they understood safety, risk, and even their own bodies. Living in a dense, uncomfortable city required constant awareness of surroundings. Fire, collapse, disease, and crowding were not distant possibilities. They were part of the mental landscape. This constant low-level alertness changed behavior in subtle but lasting ways. One of the most powerful effects of this environment was how it reshaped the sense of personal security. In ancient cities, security did not come from comfort or protection. It came from predictability. People felt safest when routines held, when crowds moved as expected, when sounds followed familiar patterns. Silence or emptiness could feel more threatening than noise. Noise meant life was continuing. Activity meant the system was functioning. This inversion of comfort is difficult to imagine today, but it was central to ancient urban psychology. Crowds acted as both burden and shield. Being alone in a city was risky. Being among many was safer, even if uncomfortable. This encouraged collective movement and discouraged isolation. People synchronized their schedules naturally, not by instruction, but by shared risk perception. When everyone moves together, individual vulnerability decreases. Collective movement reduces individuality. This dynamic also changed how people related to authority. Authority was rarely experienced as a personal force. It was embedded in the environment. Walls, streets, buildings, and crowds all communicated limits. These limits were enforced continuously without the need for direct intervention. A person did not need to be told what was possible. The city showed them. This environmental enforcement was efficient because it was constant. In ancient cities, risk was managed through density rather than separation. Fire spread easily, but it also spread predictably. Disease moved through populations, but its patterns became familiar. Over time, people adapted their behavior to minimize exposure within these constraints. Adaptation was practical, not theoretical. Survival knowledge was learned through experience rather than instruction. This learning created informal rules that reinforced official systems without replacing them. Housing pressure amplified this effect. In tightly packed dwellings, people became acutely aware of structural sounds, smells, and movements. Creaks, shifts, and vibrations carried meaning. A certain sound might indicate danger. Another signaled routine activity. Residents developed a deep, intuitive understanding of their environment. This sensory literacy made people cautious rather than curious. Caution preserves order. Ancient cities also normalized bodily discomfort. Heat, cold, hunger, thirst, and fatigue were expected parts of life. When discomfort is constant, it loses its urgency. People learn to function within it. This normalization reduced emotional volatility. Extreme reactions were inefficient. Calm endurance was rewarded. Reward does not always mean benefit. Sometimes it means survival. Work reinforced bodily adaptation. Many urban tasks were repetitive and physically demanding. Over time, bodies adjusted. Strength increased. Pain thresholds shifted. Fatigue became background. This physical conditioning aligned populations with the demands of the city. A city that demands endurance produces enduring bodies. Enduring bodies produce enduring systems. The absence of comfort also reshaped social expectations. Sympathy for hardship was limited because hardship was universal. When everyone suffers, suffering is not exceptional. This discouraged collective emotional response. Without shared outrage, conditions persisted unchanged. Shared outrage requires contrast. Ancient cities offered little contrast. Even celebrations and public events reflected this pattern. They were crowded, noisy, and physically demanding. Participation required endurance. These events did not offer relief from discomfort. They redistributed it. Pleasure was intertwined with effort. Enjoyment did not remove pressure. It temporarily redirected it. Redirection stabilizes systems without releasing them. Urban pressure also affected how people perceived the future. Long-term optimism was rare. Life expectancy was uncertain. Infrastructure endured longer than individuals. This imbalance shifted emotional investment away from personal futures and toward immediate survival. Planning focused on continuity rather than aspiration. Continuity favors existing systems. In cities like Rome, this mentality became deeply ingrained. The city itself felt eternal compared to human life. Buildings outlasted generations. Streets remained while families changed. This permanence discouraged confrontation. One does not fight what appears unchanging. Unchanging environments breed acceptance. Pressure also influenced communication. Conversations were practical, brief, and situational. Long philosophical discussion required space and quiet. Both were scarce. Ideas circulated slowly and unevenly. This limited the spread of abstract critique. Practical knowledge thrived. Abstract challenge struggled. Practicality supports stability. Even learning was shaped by discomfort. Skills were passed through demonstration and repetition rather than extended explanation. Learning by doing fit the urban environment. It required less space, less time, and less reflection. Reflection was a luxury. Luxuries destabilized necessity-driven systems. Ancient cities also taught people to measure success differently. Survival, not satisfaction, was the benchmark. A good day was one without disruption. This recalibration of success protected systems from critique. If success is defined as continuation, systems that continue appear successful regardless of quality. Quality becomes irrelevant. Pressure also shaped morality. Endurance was admired. Complaining was discouraged socially, not by rule. Complaints disrupted rhythm. Rhythm mattered. People internalized the belief that complaining was weakness. Strength meant adaptation. Adaptation reinforces power structures invisibly. The cumulative effect of this environment was a population skilled at living under constraint. Constraint became identity. Identity aligned with the city's demands. The city no longer needed to justify itself. It was what life was. This alignment explains why ancient cities could persist despite conditions that seem unbearable today. People were not constantly miserable. They were calibrated differently. Their emotional scale adjusted to their environment. Adjustment is the silent partner of endurance. Importantly, this pressure did not eliminate creativity or culture. It shaped them. Art, expression, and tradition developed within tight limits. Creativity found narrow channels. These channels were predictable and controllable. Unbounded creativity requires freedom. Bounded creativity fits systems. Systems tolerate bounded creativity. The absence of comfort also limited desire for change. Change introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty increases risk. In environments already full of risk, additional uncertainty is unwelcome. People preferred the known discomfort to unknown alternatives. Preference preserves continuity. When cities did change, they did so slowly. Rapid transformation would have disrupted adaptation patterns. Slow change allowed pressure to remain constant while forms shifted gradually. This prevented shock. Shock creates attention. Attention creates instability. Ancient cities were experts at avoiding shock. Even when disasters occurred, recovery often restored familiar patterns rather than introducing improvement. Reconstruction aimed to return things to how they were, not to make them better. Better would have meant different. Different would have meant unpredictable. Predictability mattered more than progress. This mindset challenges modern assumptions about development. We often equate improvement with comfort. Ancient cities equated survival with endurance. Endurance required pressure. Pressure shaped bodies. Pressure shaped minds. Pressure shaped systems. By the time comfort became conceivable as a goal, ancient urban traditions had already entrenched themselves deeply. Cities had proven that discomfort worked. It concentrated labor. It disciplined behavior. It stabilized populations. Stability was the ultimate metric. Understanding this helps explain why ancient cities resisted change even when technology allowed it. New materials, new techniques, and new ideas existed, but adoption was cautious. Comfort was not a compelling enough incentive to risk destabilizing proven systems. Proven systems outlast potential improvements. This does not mean ancient cities were intentionally cruel in a moral sense. It means they were optimized for conditions of scarcity, risk, and limited knowledge. Under those conditions, comfort was inefficient. Inefficiency threatened survival. Ancient cities survived because they accepted discomfort as the price of organization. They transformed hardship into structure, structure into routine, routine into endurance, endurance into history. By living inside stone pressure, generations learned to endure environments that asked much and gave little comfort in return. And because they endured, the cities endured with them. Ancient cities were not designed to let the body fully relax. Rest existed, but it was limited, conditional, and often fragmented. True physical and mental recovery, the kind that resets the body and allows reflection, was rare. This was not an oversight. Cities that discouraged rest kept populations alert, dependent, and engaged in survival rather than contemplation. To rest deeply, people need space, quiet, safety, and time. Ancient cities restricted all four. Urban layouts prioritized activity over pause. Streets connected workspaces, markets, storage areas, and administrative centers with minimal interruption. There were few transitional zones meant for lingering. Movement had direction and purpose. Standing still without reason drew attention. Attention invited scrutiny. Over time, people learned that rest was safest when brief and unobtrusive. This shaped daily rhythm. Rest did not occur in large, protected blocks of time. It happened in fragments, short pauses between tasks, moments of stillness amid noise, brief sleep interrupted by sound and heat. Fragmented rest prevents full recovery. A body that never fully recovers adapts downward, recalibrating its sense of energy and need. Lower expectations reduce frustration. Housing conditions amplified this effect. Crowded living spaces offered little separation between activity and rest. Work tools, sleeping areas, storage, and cooking often shared the same room. Even at night, cities remained active. Sounds carried easily through thin walls and shared structures. Complete silence was rare. Darkness did not bring calm, it brought uncertainty. This uncertainty kept people lightly alert even while resting. The body learned not to fully disengage. Muscles relaxed only partially. Sleep remained shallow. Over years, this state became normal. What modern observers would identify as exhaustion was simply baseline functioning. This baseline shaped culture. Cities also discouraged rest through climate exposure. Buildings provided minimal insulation. Heat lingered in stone during warm seasons. Cold seeped in during cooler periods. Resting comfortably required conditions rarely available. People adapted by reducing expectations of comfort rather than by demanding environmental change. Adaptation preserved continuity. Public spaces reinforced this pattern. Squares, intersections, and open areas were designed for transaction and gathering, not leisure. Seating was limited. Shade was inconsistent. These spaces encouraged movement rather than repose. To stop was to block flow. Flow mattered. Flow kept cities alive. Markets, in particular, were environments of constant negotiation, noise, and proximity. They demanded attention. Resting in such spaces was impractical. People entered, transacted, and exited. This constant churn minimized opportunities for disengagement. Disengagement leads to reflection. Reflection leads to comparison. Cities avoided both. Even water access discouraged rest. Fetching water required physical effort and planning. Carrying heavy containers shaped posture, strength, and daily schedule. Rest was structured around necessity rather than preference. Missed water collection disrupted everything else. This dependency anchored daily life tightly to routine. Routine left little room for pause. Social norms further discouraged extended rest. Idleness was often viewed with suspicion. A person not engaged in visible activity stood out. Standing out was risky. Over time, people internalized the idea that constant activity was normal and desirable. Desirability shapes behavior more effectively than enforcement. This constant activity created a culture where fatigue was shared. Shared fatigue normalized endurance. When everyone is tired, tiredness loses meaning. Complaints lose force. Collective exhaustion becomes invisible. Invisible exhaustion stabilizes systems. Cities also limited rest by controlling light. Narrow streets and tall buildings restricted sunlight. Indoor spaces remained dim. Natural cues for rest and wakefulness blurred. Artificial lighting was limited and expensive. People adapted to irregular cycles. Irregular cycles reduce biological synchronization with environment, increasing dependence on routine rather than natural rhythm. Dependence strengthens systems. The absence of restorative rest also affected emotional processing. Without downtime, Experiences were not fully integrated. Stress accumulated but remained diffuse. Diffuse stress does not mobilize action. It produces resignation. Resignation is quieter than anger. Ancient cities did not need to suppress anger aggressively. They diluted it through exhaustion. An exhausted population lacks the surplus energy required for sustained opposition. Energy is political. Cities consumed it. Even celebrations did not offer full relief. Festivals were physically demanding, crowded, and often exhausting in their own way. They disrupted routine briefly, but did not provide recovery. Afterward, people returned to daily life more tired than before. This cycle reinforced acceptance. Rest was also discouraged structurally through insecurity. Fires, structural collapse, and disease were constant possibilities. This background risk kept people alert. A fully relaxed body is vulnerable. Cities trained bodies to remain partially tense. Partial tension became habit. Habit reshaped posture, movement, and expression. Urban bodies moved differently from rural ones. They were accustomed to constraint, compression, and alertness. These bodies fit the city's demands. The city and its inhabitants shaped each other. Mutual shaping deepened endurance. Ancient cities also limited rest intellectually. Information overload was constant at the local level, but broader context was scarce. People dealt with immediate problems continuously. There was little opportunity to step back and evaluate the system as a whole. Evaluation requires distance. Distance was unavailable. Even education followed this pattern. Learning occurred through apprenticeship and repetition rather than abstract study. Skills were practiced, not theorized. Practice consumed energy. Theory requires rest. Rest creates thinkers. Cities produce doers. This distinction mattered. Doers maintained systems. Thinkers questioned them. Ancient cities needed the former more than the latter. The discouragement of rest also shaped how people understood time. Without deep rest, days blur. Blurred days compress memory. Compressed memory reduces awareness of gradual change. Change becomes difficult to perceive. Difficulty of perception preserves stability. People sensed hardship but could not easily articulate its progression. Without articulation, dissatisfaction remained private. Private dissatisfaction does not coordinate. Coordination threatens order. Cities also discouraged rest through sound. Constant background noise prevented deep silence. Silence invites introspection. Noise anchors attention outward. Outward attention maintains engagement with routine. Even at night, sounds persisted. Animals, people, tools, and weather created an acoustic environment that rarely allowed complete disengagement. People slept with awareness rather than abandonment. Abandonment is risky. Urban life rewarded vigilance. This vigilance extended into social interaction. Trust existed but was cautious. Crowding required negotiation. Negotiation required awareness. Awareness required energy. Energy spent on vigilance was energy not spent on reflection. Ancient cities thus created a paradoxical state. Populations constantly active, yet rarely progressing. Activity maintained survival. Lack of rest prevented transformation. Transformation requires recovery. By discouraging rest, cities stabilized themselves. They kept people busy, tired, and focused on immediate needs. These conditions did not eliminate creativity or joy, but they constrained them. Expression found narrow channels compatible with exhaustion. Exhausted creativity is manageable. The result was a form of urban life that could persist under extreme conditions. Cities absorbed shocks because people were already operating at reduced capacity. Additional strain felt like extension rather than rupture. Rupture requires contrast. Contrast was absent. Understanding this aspect of ancient urban design changes how we interpret endurance. Cities did not last because they made life better. They lasted because they made life survivable within narrow bounds. Those bounds discouraged rest, and in doing so, discouraged resistance. People rested just enough to continue. That was sufficient. Ancient cities were not spaces of renewal. They were spaces of continuation. They demanded constant engagement and offered little recovery. Yet through this imbalance, they achieved remarkable longevity. They endured because their people endured. And endurance, shaped by limited rest, was built into the very structure of the city. The discouragement of rest did more than exhaust bodies. It reshaped social life itself. In ancient cities, relationships formed and survived within narrow margins of time and energy. Friendship, family bonds, and community ties existed, but they were compressed into functional interactions. Long, reflective conversations were rare. Emotional processing was abbreviated. This did not erase connection, it altered its form. People learned to communicate efficiently, often indirectly, through habit and shared routine rather than extended dialogue. This efficiency had consequences. When communication is compressed, nuance fades. Complex dissatisfaction struggles to find expression. What remains are practical concerns: food, work, shelter, immediate safety. Broader questions about fairness, purpose, or alternatives require leisure to surface. Leisure was scarce. Scarcity shaped attention. Attention in ancient cities was consumed by maintenance of life rather than exploration of meaning. Even moments that might have invited reflection were interrupted by obligation. A pause became a preparation for the next task rather than a space for thought. Over time, this produced a mindset oriented toward continuity. People measured success by whether they endured another day, not by whether the day was fulfilling. Fulfillment is a modern expectation. Ancient urban life cultivated a different metric: sufficiency. Enough food, enough water, enough shelter to last the season, enough energy to continue working. When sufficiency becomes the goal, comfort feels unnecessary. Desire narrows. Narrow desire stabilizes systems. Cities also discouraged rest through social surveillance. In dense environments, people are constantly visible. Visibility regulates behavior without formal enforcement. A person who rests too openly attracts attention. Attention invites judgment. Judgment encourages conformity. Over time, people internalize the idea that visible rest is indulgent or risky. This internalization is powerful because it does not require punishment. Public perception became a tool. Reputation mattered. A reputation for diligence protected individuals. A reputation for idleness exposed them. Even when formal authority was absent, social pressure filled the gap. Cities functioned as self-regulating environments. Self-regulation is cheaper than enforcement. The built environment amplified this effect. Doorways opened directly onto streets. Windows overlooked neighbors. Sounds traveled. Privacy was thin. There were few places to retreat completely. Without retreat, rest remained partial. Partial rest maintains vigilance. Vigilance shaped moral values. Industriousness became virtue. Endurance became strength. Complaining became weakness. These values were not imposed by doctrine. They emerged organically from lived conditions. Once internalized, they defended the system from critique. Critique requires moral distance. Moral distance requires space and time. Ancient cities also discouraged rest by shaping how people experienced reward. Rewards were rarely restful. Celebration involved crowds, noise, and effort. Feasting required preparation and cleanup. Even joy demanded work. This blurred the line between labor and leisure. When leisure feels like labor, people stop expecting relief. This expectation mattered. A population that does not expect relief adapts to strain. Adaptation replaces demand. Demand creates pressure on systems. Systems resist pressure by avoiding demand. Avoidance preserves stability. Another consequence of limited rest was the blunting of long-term memory. Without periods of deep recovery, experiences did not consolidate clearly. Days merged. Weeks blurred. Years passed without distinct markers. This temporal compression made gradual deterioration difficult to notice. Deterioration unnoticed is deterioration unchallenged. This phenomenon explains why many ancient cities declined slowly without provoking immediate response. Life became incrementally harder, but without contrast, hardship felt normal. People adapted again and again until adaptation reached its limit. Limits appear suddenly when approached gradually. Cities also discouraged rest by limiting control over personal schedules. Work was dictated by daylight, markets, and shared infrastructure. Individual preference mattered little. When schedules are externally imposed, autonomy diminishes. Autonomy encourages experimentation. Reduced autonomy preserves routine. Routine is predictable. Predictability is manageable. The psychological effect of this scheduling was subtle but significant. People experience time as something that happened to them rather than something they shaped. When time feels external, people adapt to it rather than attempting to control it. This reinforces acceptance of broader systems. Acceptance is quiet. Ancient cities also shaped childhood differently. Children grew up in environments where rest was scarce and activity constant. From an early age, they learned to function amid noise, heat, and crowding. Their nervous systems adapted accordingly. What would later be called stress was simply life. Early adaptation normalizes constraint. By adulthood, these individuals did not experience the city as oppressive. It was familiar. Familiarity breeds tolerance. Tolerance sustains systems. This adaptation also affected aging. Older individuals adjusted by reducing expectation rather than by demanding accommodation. Cities offered little in the way of comfort for the elderly. Those who could not adapt relied on family. Family became the buffer, not the city. Buffering shifts responsibility away from systems. Systems benefited. Ancient cities also discouraged rest intellectually by limiting access to information beyond immediate needs. Knowledge circulated locally and practically. Broader understanding required resources and time that few possessed. Without broader context, people interpreted their experiences as personal rather than systemic. Systemic understanding fuels change. Personal interpretation disperses it. Even when individuals sensed something was wrong, they lacked the framework to articulate it collectively. Without shared language or concepts, dissatisfaction remained fragmented. Fragmentation protects authority. Authority thrives in fragmentation. The discouragement of rest, thus, served multiple functions simultaneously. It consumed energy. It narrowed desire. It blurred memory. It fragmented understanding. It fostered self-regulation. Each effect reinforced the others. Together, they created an environment remarkably resistant to disruption. Resistance requires surplus. Surplus requires rest. Ancient cities minimized both. This does not mean people never rested or found joy. It means rest and joy existed within constraints that prevented them from becoming transformative. Joy was episodic. Rest was incomplete. Neither accumulated enough momentum to reshape expectations. Expectation defines tolerance. Tolerance defines endurance. Cities that discouraged rest did not need to justify themselves. They were environments that worked. They organized labor. They concentrated population. They projected authority. They survived. Survival was success. From the outside, these cities can appear inhumane. From within, they were simply life. People did not measure their cities against ideals of comfort. They measured them against the alternative: instability, exposure, uncertainty. Compared to that, the city, even harsh, was preferable. Preference preserves systems. This perspective challenges romantic views of ancient urban life. It reminds us that cities are not neutral containers. They shape bodies, minds, and behavior. Ancient cities shaped them toward endurance rather than ease. Ease invites questioning. Endurance invites continuation. By discouraging rest, ancient cities ensured that people remained engaged, vigilant, and dependent. They reduced the space for reflection that might have led to dissatisfaction. They limited recovery that might have produced surplus energy. They did not make people happy. They made them enduring. And through that endurance, the cities themselves endured. Ancient cities were not only uncomfortable places to live. They were environments carefully shaped to control how people moved. Movement determined access to food, work, water, authority, and safety. By shaping movement, cities shaped behavior. This was one of the least visible but most powerful aspects of ancient urban design, and it explains why many cities felt exhausting, confusing, and restrictive even when they functioned efficiently. In modern cities, movement is often treated as a right. Streets are wide, signage is clear, and navigation is meant to be intuitive. Ancient cities operated on the opposite logic. Confusion was not always a flaw. It was often intentional. Streets twisted, narrowed, and dead-ended. Buildings encroached unpredictably. Visibility was limited. From ground level, the city rarely revealed itself as a whole. People experienced it in fragments. This fragmentation mattered. When people cannot easily orient themselves, they rely on habit rather than choice. They follow familiar routes, visit known places, and avoid experimentation. Habitual movement is predictable. Predictable movement is easy to monitor, regulate, and tax. Ancient cities benefited enormously from this predictability. Cities like Rome demonstrate this clearly. Despite later attempts at monumental planning, much of the city grew through layered accumulation rather than rational layout. Narrow alleys connected to wider streets without clear logic. From above, the city might appear organized. From within, it felt disorienting. This disorientation slowed movement and discouraged unnecessary travel. People stayed close to where they lived and worked. Local life became dominant. Local life reduces collective awareness. When people move widely and freely, they compare conditions. Comparison fuels dissatisfaction. Ancient cities limited comparison by limiting movement. A resident might know their neighborhood intimately, but know little beyond it. The city became a mosaic of small worlds rather than a unified space. Fragmentation prevented large-scale coordination. Gateways and choke points reinforced this control. Entrances to markets, administrative areas, and storage zones were narrow and monitored. Flow was regulated physically rather than through constant supervision. Bottlenecks slowed crowds and made activity visible. A slow crowd is easier to manage than a fast one. Speed is disruptive. Slowness is stable. Movement was also constrained vertically. Stairs were steep and narrow. Upper levels were difficult to access quickly. This limited rapid congregation. It also reinforced hierarchy. Those higher up were physically and socially removed, but not comfortable. Climbing itself was effort. Effort discouraged unnecessary movement. Effort shapes decision-making. Public spaces were positioned strategically rather than generously. Large open areas were rare and purposeful. They existed for specific functions, not casual gathering. Their scarcity meant that when people did gather, it was noticeable. Noticeable gatherings attracted oversight. Oversight discouraged spontaneity. Spontaneity threatens order. Even infrastructure that appears neutral, such as drainage and water channels, influenced movement. These systems created barriers and boundaries that shaped pathways. Wet areas, uneven ground, and waste zones discouraged lingering. People learned where not to go as much as where to go. Avoidance patterns became ingrained. Ingrained patterns reduced choice. Markets were intentionally congested. Tight layouts forced people to move slowly and interact repeatedly. Repetition reinforced familiarity. Familiarity reduced conflict. At the same time, congestion limited escape routes. Disputes were less likely to escalate when movement was constrained. Constraint disciplines behavior. The absence of signage further reinforced dependence on local knowledge. Without clear markers, newcomers relied on residents. Residents became guides. This created informal hierarchies and reinforced community control. Knowledge of the city became a form of power. Power distributed locally is easier to manage centrally. Movement at night was even more restricted. Limited lighting narrowed usable space. Darkness simplified control by shrinking the active city. People stayed close to home. Activity consolidated. Consolidation reduced unpredictability. Predictability preserved stability. Importantly, these movement constraints did not need constant enforcement. The city itself enforced them. Walls, turns, steps, slopes, and crowds communicated limits silently. People adapted because adaptation was necessary. Over time, constrained movement felt normal. Normality suppresses resistance. The psychological effect of limited movement was subtle but profound. People internalized boundaries. They stopped imagining spaces beyond their routines. Curiosity narrowed. Exploration declined. Life became local by default. This local focus anchored people emotionally and practically to small zones within the city. Small zones fragment awareness. Fragmented awareness prevents collective challenge. Even when cities expanded, new areas often replicated old patterns. Expansion did not bring openness. It brought repetition. Repetition reinforced expectation. Expectation stabilized behavior. Stability mattered more than efficiency. Ancient cities were not inefficient by accident. They were optimized for control under conditions of limited technology and constant risk. Controlling movement reduced crime, limited unrest, and simplified administration. It also made life tiring, frustrating, and uncomfortable. Discomfort was the cost of control. People accepted this cost because alternatives were uncertain. Outside the city walls lay exposure and instability. Inside lay constraint and endurance. Most chose endurance. Choice itself was constrained. This is why ancient cities could feel oppressive without constant force. The environment did the work. Movement patterns shaped thought. Thought shaped behavior. Behavior reinforced the city. Cities that controlled movement controlled people. As we continue, we'll see how this same logic extended into access to resources and opportunity, further reinforcing cities that were never meant to feel easy to live in. only possible to survive. To understand how deeply ancient cities controlled movement, we must recognize that movement was never neutral. Every step a person took inside an ancient city carried economic, social, and administrative meaning. Where you walked determined what you saw, who you met, what you could access, and what you could not. Ancient cities were not maps meant to be read easily. They were experiences meant to be learned slowly, through repetition, error, and constraint. This learning process itself was part of how cities shaped behavior. Movement control began at the most basic level, entry and exit. City gates were narrow, limited in number, and heavily structured. They were not simply openings in walls. They were filters. People passed through them daily, often at predictable times, creating natural rhythms of inflow and outflow. These rhythms made the population legible. Even without constant supervision, the city could be felt through movement patterns. Unusual timing stood out. Irregular flow attracted attention. Regularity blended into silence. Once inside, the city offered no clear overview. Ancient residents did not experience their city as a unified whole. They experienced it as sequences of spaces connected by habit. A street did not lead logically to another street. It led to a memory. Turn here, avoid that path, slow down here, wait there. Navigation was embodied knowledge, not abstract understanding. This embodied navigation limited autonomy. A person could only move confidently where they already belonged. Belonging defined mobility. This mattered because mobility equals opportunity. When people can move freely, they can compare prices, conditions, and treatment. They can choose alternatives. Ancient cities limited this by making long-distance movement inside the city mentally and physically costly. Getting lost was easy. Finding unfamiliar places required guidance. Guidance created dependence. Dependence reduced independence. Markets illustrate this perfectly. Markets were rarely centralized in a way that made access easy for everyone. Instead, they were embedded in dense neighborhoods, surrounded by narrow streets that slowed approach and exit. Reaching a market was not just a matter of distance. It was a matter of endurance and familiarity. This limited how often people traveled far for trade. Local exchange dominated. Local exchange reduced competition. Reduced competition stabilized prices and expectations. Stability mattered more than choice. Movement control also shaped social interaction. People encountered the same faces repeatedly because they followed the same routes at the same times. Familiarity bred predictability. Predictability reduced conflict. Strangers stood out immediately because they moved differently. They hesitated. They asked questions. They disrupted flow. Disruption drew attention. Attention increased vulnerability. This subtle pressure encouraged conformity without instruction. In cities like Rome, the effect of accumulated layers of construction intensified these patterns. As buildings were added over centuries, older pathways were partially obscured, repurposed, or narrowed. Instead of clearing space, cities adapted to congestion. This adaptation preserved memory over logic. People knew where to go because they always had. Rational redesign would have erased that memory. Memory was power. Power embedded in habit is difficult to challenge. Vertical movement added another layer of control. Stairs were steep, narrow, and poorly lit. Climbing required effort and attention. Descending required caution. Rapid vertical movement was nearly impossible. This limited how quickly people could gather, disperse, or flee. It also discouraged unnecessary travel between levels. Upper floors became socially and functionally distinct not because they were comfortable, but because reaching them required commitment. Commitment filters behavior. Movement control extended into access to water, storage, and administration. These critical resources were rarely placed in open, easily accessible areas. They were tucked behind layers of streets, courtyards, and controlled entry points. Reaching them required knowledge and patience. This reduced spontaneous use and reinforced formal procedures. Procedures slowed access. Slowed access increased compliance. Compliance thrives in slow systems. Even religious and ceremonial spaces followed this logic. Approaching them often required navigating through dense urban fabric. The journey itself prepared the body and mind. Fatigue softened emotion. Crowding reduced individuality. By the time people arrived, they were already conditioned to accept order. Movement served as psychological preparation. Preparation reduces resistance. The absence of wide, straight avenues in many ancient cities is often misunderstood as technological limitation. In reality, wide avenues allow speed, visibility, and mass movement. Speed enables escape. Visibility enables coordination. Mass movement enables collective action. Narrow streets disrupted all three. They fragmented crowds into smaller groups. They slowed progress. They blocked sightlines. People could hear activity nearby, but could not easily see or join it. Sound without sight creates uncertainty. Uncertainty discourages participation. Movement control also worked through fatigue. Simply moving through the city consumed energy. Carrying goods, navigating crowds, climbing stairs, and avoiding obstacles made travel physically costly. When movement is tiring, people minimize it. They choose nearby options even if they are inferior. Inferior options become normalized. Normalization stabilizes inequality. Inequality embedded in geography feels natural. Over time, people internalized these movement costs. They stopped asking whether something farther away might be better. They adjusted desire to proximity. Desire shaped by proximity does not challenge structure. It accepts it. Acceptance is the quiet foundation of endurance. Movement patterns also regulated time. Travel took longer than expected. Delays were normal. Waiting became routine. When waiting is routine, urgency disappears. Without urgency, pressure dissipates. Systems operate best when pressure is low. Ancient cities thrived on low pressure. Even when people needed to move quickly, the city resisted them. Turns, crowds, obstacles, and elevation slowed intent. The environment absorbed urgency and converted it into effort. Effort tires. Tired people abandon urgency. Abandoned urgency preserves order. This environmental resistance reduced the need for enforcement. The city did not need to stop people actively. It exhausted them passively. Passive control is durable because it feels impersonal. People do not argue with stone. Stone does not negotiate. Movement control also affected how information traveled. Messages moved with people. Slower movement meant slower information spread. Slower information prevented rapid alignment of knowledge. Without alignment, collective action struggled to form. Different neighborhoods learned things at different times. Time gaps fragmented response. Fragmented response protects authority. Importantly, these patterns did not require centralized planning to remain effective. Once established, they reinforced themselves. New buildings adapted to existing streets. New routes followed old habits. Change occurred within constraint, not outside it. The city preserved its own logic through accumulation rather than redesign. Accumulation favors inertia. Even disasters rarely altered movement patterns permanently. Fires destroyed structures, but rebuilding followed familiar lines. Collapse was repaired, not reimagined. Familiarity mattered more than improvement. Improvement would have required new movement logic. New logic would have disrupted habit. Habit was sacred. Movement control also shaped imagination. People imagined their lives within reachable spaces. Dreams aligned with routes. Ambition followed paths that already existed. Paths that did not exist were not imagined. This invisible ceiling limited aspiration without explicit restriction. Restriction without visibility is powerful. Children learned these patterns early. They memorized safe routes, dangerous shortcuts, and forbidden zones. This knowledge passed between generations, orally and physically. Movement wisdom became culture. Culture became control. Control did not feel imposed. It felt learned. Even visitors sensed this immediately. Outsiders moved differently. They hesitated. They asked. They made mistakes. Residents noticed. Outsiders felt exposed. Exposure discouraged long-term deviation. To survive, one had to learn the city's rhythm. Learning required submission. Submission disguised as adaptation is effective. Ancient cities did not need to convince people to stay in their lanes. The lanes taught people themselves. Over time, these lanes became invisible. People no longer felt constrained. They felt normal. Normality is the final form of control. This is why ancient cities could be deeply restrictive without appearing overtly oppressive. There were no constant commands, no continuous oversight, no obvious force. The city itself shaped behavior through effort, confusion, fatigue, and habit. Movement was not free because freedom was not the goal. The goal was continuity. By controlling how people moved, ancient cities controlled how people lived, what they knew, whom they trusted, and what they imagined possible. Comfort would have loosened these controls. Ease would have widened paths. Open paths invite change. Change was dangerous. Ancient cities chose endurance over ease. They shaped movement accordingly. And because movement shaped everything else, the cities endured, crowded, uncomfortable, exhausting, and remarkably stable. Ancient cities did not only control how people moved, they controlled something far more decisive: access to survival itself. Food, water, shelter, work, and protection were never evenly or freely available. They were distributed through systems embedded into the city structure. To live inside an ancient city was to live inside a web of dependencies. These dependencies were not accidental. They were the core reason cities existed in the first place. Unlike modern cities, where infrastructure is often designed to reduce friction, ancient cities used friction deliberately. Access required effort. Effort created dependence. Dependence created compliance. This was not enforced through constant authority. It was enforced through necessity. Food was the most obvious example. Ancient cities could not produce enough food within their walls. They relied on surrounding regions, storage systems, and controlled distribution. For ordinary residents, food did not simply appear in abundance. It had to be acquired daily, often through tightly regulated markets. These markets were crowded, repetitive, and exhausting. The process of obtaining food consumed time and energy, anchoring daily life to specific locations and schedules. This anchoring mattered. When people must return to the same place repeatedly to meet basic needs, they become predictable. Predictable populations are manageable. A city that feeds its people indirectly rather than freely ensures constant engagement with its systems. Scarcity was rarely extreme, but it was rarely absent. Mild scarcity kept attention focused. When food is always just enough, people plan carefully. They conserve. They comply with routine. Excess abundance would have reduced urgency. Reduced urgency weakens control. Water access followed the same logic. Even when advanced water systems existed, they were rarely designed for individual convenience. Water sources were shared, centralized, and time-consuming to use. Carrying water shaped posture, schedules, and social interaction. Missing water collection disrupted everything else. This created daily dependence on shared infrastructure. Shared dependence strengthens authority without force. Shelter was similarly conditional. Living space inside cities was limited, crowded, and often temporary. Buildings aged quickly. Repairs were frequent but minimal. Housing was something to endure rather than enjoy. Those who failed to maintain access to shelter were pushed outward, away from opportunity and protection. This threat did not need to be spoken. It was visible. Work tied all of this together. Employment in ancient cities was rarely stable in a modern sense. It was seasonal, repetitive, and physically demanding. Work opportunities clustered around certain areas and times. To access them, people had to be present, punctual, and reliable. Absence carried consequences. Reliability was not just valued. It was necessary. This necessity trained behavior. People adjusted sleep, movement, and social life around work availability. Life became structured around external demands. When survival depends on showing up repeatedly, questioning the system feels risky. Risk was something ancient city dwellers could rarely afford. Markets, workshops, storage areas, and administrative centers were placed deliberately. They were not distributed evenly across the city. Some neighborhoods were closer to resources. Others were farther. Distance translated into effort. Effort translated into hierarchy. Hierarchy felt natural because it was embedded in geography rather than declared. Geography is persuasive. Over time, people internalized their position. They planned within it rather than against it. Aspirations aligned with access. Access aligned with movement. Movement aligned with habit. Habit aligned with the city. This alignment stabilized inequality without constant enforcement. Ancient cities also controlled survival through information. Knowledge about prices, availability, and opportunity traveled slowly and unevenly. People relied on local networks rather than centralized clarity. This limited competition and reduced coordination. Reduced coordination prevented collective bargaining or demand. Demand requires shared knowledge. Shared knowledge was scarce. The city itself shaped what people knew. Narrow social circles, local movement, and constant labor limited exposure. Without comparison, dissatisfaction remained localized. A person blamed circumstance, not structure. Structure remained invisible. Protection was another controlled resource. City walls offered safety from external threats, but only to those inside. This created a powerful incentive to remain compliant. Leaving the city meant exposure. Remaining meant endurance. Most chose endurance. Endurance was rewarded with survival, not comfort. Even public assistance, where it existed, followed this pattern. Help was procedural, conditional, and limited. It did not eliminate hardship. It prevented collapse. Preventing collapse preserved labor. Preserving labor preserved the city. The city did not need people to thrive. It needed them to function. This distinction is crucial. Ancient cities were not designed to maximize well-being. They were designed to minimize disruption. As long as people continued to work, trade, and endure, the city succeeded. Discomfort was acceptable. Breakdown was not. Access to survival was therefore never unconditional. It flowed through routines, spaces, and systems. People learned these systems intuitively. Learning created familiarity. Familiarity created acceptance. Acceptance is more durable than fear. Over generations, this model produced populations deeply adapted to constraint. They did not imagine cities as places that should care for them. They imagined cities as places that demanded effort in exchange for opportunity. Opportunity was narrow but real. Those who navigated the system well could survive, raise families, and pass on knowledge. Those who failed adapted or left. The city filtered its population quietly. Quiet filtering is effective. This filtering also reinforced cultural values. Discipline, patience, and endurance were admired. Excess desire was discouraged. Contentment was defined not by abundance, but by continuity. Continuity meant tomorrow would arrive. This worldview explains why ancient cities could persist despite conditions that appear harsh by modern standards. They controlled access to survival in ways that made the city indispensable. Indispensable systems are rarely challenged directly. Challenge risks loss. Loss was unacceptable. Ancient cities taught people to live within limits rather than seek to change them. These limits were physical, social, and psychological. Together, they formed an environment where survival depended on cooperation with the city's rhythms. Rhythms replaced rules. By the time anyone questioned whether life could be easier, the city had already shaped the answer. Ease was dangerous, effort was normal, and endurance was life. This is why ancient cities were never meant to be comfortable. Comfort weakens dependence. Dependence sustains systems. Systems sustain cities. And cities, once built this way, could last far longer than the people living inside them ever expected. What made ancient cities so enduring was not only how they controlled access to food, water, work, and shelter, but how completely those controls reshaped the way people understood life itself. Over time, survival inside the city stopped feeling conditional and started feeling natural. People no longer experienced access as something granted by a system. They experienced it as the way the world worked. This shift, from awareness to assumption, was the final and most powerful stage of urban control. In these cities, survival was never framed as a right. It was framed as an outcome of correct behavior. Show up, follow routine, endure discomfort, remain visible but not disruptive. Those who met these conditions survived. Those who did not adapted, moved outward, or disappeared from the city's core life. Because this process happened gradually and impersonally, it did not feel like exclusion. It felt like consequence. Consequence teaches faster than command. Over generations, people internalized the idea that effort was inseparable from existence. Life was something you earned every day. This belief narrowed moral expectation. When survival feels earned rather than guaranteed, people stop asking whether systems are fair. They ask whether they are behaving correctly. Attention turns inward. Systems remain unexamined. Ancient cities thrived on this inward focus. Daily life reinforced it constantly. Obtaining food required timing, patience, and familiarity. Missing a market window had immediate consequences. Water collection shaped daily schedules and physical capacity. Work opportunities depended on reputation and reliability. Shelter depended on continued participation in the city's rhythms. None of these dependencies required explanation. They were learned through repetition. Repetition is persuasive. Because access was conditional, people developed strategies to minimize risk rather than maximize comfort. They chose predictability over opportunity. A less desirable but reliable arrangement was safer than a potentially better but uncertain one. Over time, this risk-avoidant behavior became cultural. Stability was admired. Caution was respected. Ambition was tolerated only when it did not threaten routine. Routine became morality. This moral framing mattered. When survival aligns with moral identity, systems gain deep legitimacy. People defend the structure that validates their effort. Criticizing the system feels like criticizing oneself. This self-protective instinct insulated cities from challenge far more effectively than fear ever could. Fear creates resistance. Identity creates loyalty. Even when people recognized hardship, they rarely interpreted it as systemic failure. Hardship was proof of effort. Effort was proof of worth. Worth justified endurance. This circular logic closed off critique. The city did not need to claim legitimacy. People generated it themselves. The architecture of the city reinforced this mindset. Massive walls, dense housing, and visible infrastructure communicated permanence. These structures outlasted individuals. Children grew up seeing buildings older than their grandparents. This temporal imbalance shaped humility. If the city endures while people pass, then people adjust to the city, not the other way around. Adjustment feels rational in the face of permanence. Ancient cities also controlled survival by limiting alternatives. Rural life was uncertain. Smaller settlements lacked protection, markets, and opportunity. The city, despite its discomfort, offered relative security. This comparison mattered. People did not evaluate the city against an ideal. They evaluated it against risk. Risk disciplined desire. As long as the city remained the safest option, its internal conditions were tolerated. Complaints existed, but they rarely escalated. Escalation threatened access. Access was survival. Survival silenced complaint. Silence preserved continuity. This dynamic also explains why ancient cities could absorb newcomers without dramatically changing. New arrivals entered existing systems. They adapted quickly because adaptation was required. The city did not need to integrate them ideologically. It integrated them practically. Work, shelter, and access did the work. Practical integration is faster than persuasion. Over time, this produced a population that shared habits rather than beliefs. Habits are harder to challenge than beliefs because they operate below conscious thought. When people act out routines automatically, they stop evaluating them. Evaluation fades. Acceptance deepens. Acceptance without awareness is durable. The control of survival also fragmented solidarity. Because access varied by neighborhood, profession, and timing, hardship was uneven. Uneven hardship prevents unified response. People experiencing difficulty assumed others were coping. Without shared experience, collective demand did not form. Fragmentation protects systems. Even assistance, when provided, followed conditional logic. Support was limited, procedural, and often required proof of compliance. This reinforced the idea that survival depended on correct behavior. Assistance did not challenge the system. It validated it. Validation strengthens authority. Ancient cities also shaped emotional resilience around survival. People learned to tolerate uncertainty as long as routines held. They became skilled at managing scarcity, delay, and disappointment. These skills were adaptive but also limiting. They reduced sensitivity to systemic decline. Decline became visible only when routines broke entirely. Until that point, people adjusted again and again. Adjustment delayed rupture. Rupture is dangerous to systems. Delay is protective. The final effect of survival control was psychological narrowing. People focused on immediate needs rather than long-term transformation. Long-term thinking requires surplus. Surplus requires ease. Ease was rare. Without surplus, imagination contracts. Contracted imagination limits change. This is why ancient cities often appear static in retrospect. Not because nothing happened, but because change happened within tight bounds. Innovation occurred, but cautiously. Improvements were incremental and framed as maintenance. Anything that threatened survival systems was resisted instinctively. Instinct is faster than reasoning. By the time conditions deteriorated enough to provoke widespread awareness, the city's logic had already shaped response. People waited. They endured. They hoped routines would return. Hope delayed action. Action came only when survival access collapsed broadly and visibly. Collapse was not dramatic at first. It was logistical. Understanding ancient cities through this lens challenges modern assumptions about urban success. We tend to measure success by comfort, health, and satisfaction. Ancient cities measured success by persistence. Persistence required control. Control required dependence. Dependence required discomfort. Discomfort was not an unfortunate byproduct. It was structural. These cities were not built for happiness. They were built for continuity. They organized life around effort, routine, and necessity. In doing so, they created societies capable of enduring extreme conditions for centuries. People adapted because adaptation was the only viable option. That adaptation shaped culture, values, and expectations so thoroughly that the city no longer needed to assert itself. Survival systems enforced behavior silently. Over time, the city became the background of existence rather than an object of thought. Background systems are the hardest to remove. This is why ancient cities that were never meant to be comfortable lasted so long. They embedded survival into structure. They turned effort into identity. They made endurance normal and ease suspicious. Comfort invites question. Question invites change. Ancient cities avoided both. They asked people to endure, not to flourish. And because people endured, the cities endured with them. Crowded, exhausting, uncompromising, and remarkably stable. In the end, these cities reveal a hard truth about power and design. Environments shape behavior more reliably than rules ever can. Ancient cities did not rule their populations loudly. They shaped them quietly, through stone, routine, and necessity. They were never meant to feel good. Ancient cities were not unfinished versions of modern ones. They were not waiting to become comfortable. They were complete systems built around a different idea of success. Comfort was never the goal. Endurance was. These cities concentrated people, labor, and resources under conditions that demanded adaptation rather than satisfaction. Narrow streets, crowded housing, constant noise, limited rest, controlled movement, and conditional access to survival were not accidents or failures of planning. They were deliberate outcomes of priorities that valued stability over ease and continuity over well-being. By shaping bodies through pressure, minds through routine, and behavior through necessity, ancient cities reduced the need for constant authority. Power did not need to announce itself. It was embedded in stone, in daily effort, in habit. People adjusted their expectations downward until discomfort felt normal and endurance felt virtuous. Once that adjustment occurred, resistance lost its energy. This is why so many ancient cities lasted for centuries despite conditions that seem unbearable today. They did not promise better lives. They promised survival within strict limits. And as long as survival was possible, people stayed, adapted, and endured. Looking back, ruins invite romantic imagination. But behind those stones were lives shaped by exhaustion, repetition, and constraint. These cities worked not because they were humane, but because they were effective. They turned hardship into structure and structure into permanence. Understanding this changes how we read history. It reminds us that power does not always appear as force or spectacle. Sometimes it appears as design, as routine, as an environment that quietly teaches people what to accept. Ancient cities were never meant to be comfortable. They were meant to last. Thank you for watching until the end. If this perspective made you see ancient cities differently, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your curiosity keeps these deep historical explorations alive.